Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing really well. Welcome to What the Horror, where this humble horror fan shares her thoughts on horror films past and present. In today's episode we're going to be talking about Candyman, released this year in 2021. Well, this review is better late than never. Just a heads up, in this episode I am going to be including spoilers, so if you haven't seen the film yet, I would recommend you go and watch it first and then come back to the episode. For decades now, since the original came out in 1992, there has been talk of more sequels or a prequel to the original. One idea was a prequel that would delve into and explore the love story between Candyman and Helen Lyle, and another idea was a crossover with Leprechaun from the Leprechaun series, taking inspiration from another successful crossover, Freddy vs. Jason. Tony Todd, however, was not a fan of this idea. Eventually, in 2018, it was announced that Jordan Peele and Win Rosenfeld would produce a sequel to the original, and Nia DaCosta signed on to direct. DaCosta also co-wrote the screenplay with Jordan Peele and Win Rosenfeld. Now, unfortunately, what seems to have happened, at least what happened when the film was released, is that Candyman is considered a Jordan Peele film. It's his name that is attributed to the film. And yes, it's true, he is involved in it. He produced it and he co-wrote the screenplay. However, Nia DaCosta also co-wrote the screenplay and she is the one who directed it. It's also worth noting that Nia DaCosta actually made history with the release of Candyman, becoming the first female black director to have their film debut in the top spot of the domestic box office. I guess I just feel that credit should be given where credit is due. For decades, the housing projects of Chicago's Cabrini Green were terrorized by a ghost story about a supernatural hook-handed killer. In present day, an artist begins to explore the macabre history of Candyman, not knowing it would unravel his sanity and unleash a terrifying wave of violence that puts him on a collision course with destiny. So Candyman 2021 is a direct sequel to the original, completely ignoring the other sequels. It follows the pattern or the new trend that seems to be happening, similar to Halloween 2018, where it is a direct sequel to the original film, but it also shares the same title as the original film. Although I think requel is probably a better term for what Candyman is, as yes, it is a sequel to the original, but it's also kind of a soft reboot to the franchise, adding new ideas to the Candyman legend. In this film, Candyman is more of an idea rather than a singular person like in the original film. In the film, it's described as a hive of men who have been killed in extreme violence or extreme pain, which has then left a mark or a scar on the world. And these men then evolve into myth and legend, becoming the titular Candyman. And which Candyman you have depends on which story you know, which version of the Candyman legend you hear as to which Candyman is yours and which appears to you. As well as the new development in the legend of Candyman, the idea that Candyman is this symbol through the generations, representing these traumas being repeated again and again. Candyman's other main themes are that of gentrification and the idea of being exploited for your past pains. An example of this is Anthony using the past pains of Cabrini Green in his artwork, but also his girlfriend being headhunted for a job because of the murder of her co-worker Clive and of the death of her father, who was an artist as well. I have to say that watching Candyman, it wasn't clear for a while as to whether or not what Anthony was experiencing and seeing, if that was actually real, or if it was a representation of him slowly descending into madness. I didn't know if they were actually going to go down the route of it being Anthony who was committing these crimes while he slowly lost his grip on reality. I think this might have been influenced by the fact that I had watched Black Swan the day before, and Candyman is very reminiscent of the Black Swan. You have two artists who become increasingly obsessed with their work and weighed down by a certain level of expectation and pressure, whether this is from outside sources or from within. Their sanity slowly unravels. Both characters seemingly hallucinate. They have issues with damaged skin, which then leads to some quite gnarly body horror. However, where Candyman differs from Black Swan is that what is actually happening to Anthony is real, and rather than a self-inflicted descent into madness, Anthony seems to be the victim of an inescapable fate. Okay, so let's look at what I thought were some positives of Candyman. First off, for me, a huge positive is the cinematography of this film. This film is visually stunning. Very early on in the film, we have some really striking shots of Chicago as well. I also loved the use of sound in this film. The soundtrack is brilliant, done by Robert Lowe, and I always appreciate a good film soundtrack, but it's more than the film soundtrack. It's the use of sound within certain scenes. A perfect example of this is a scene very early on where Anthony is walking around the original site of Cabrini Green. It's actually one of my favourite scenes in the whole film, and he's just silently walking around taking photographs, but what the audience can hear they can hear birds and his footsteps and bees buzzing. You can hear the breeze blowing at times. You can hear cars driving past. There's also a very loud hum of crickets. And over the top of all of these sounds, every now and again, there's this other sound that pulsates over them, and it reminded me of a heart beating. There are all these little signs of life going on around him. Another positive for me are the puppet show animations done by artist Kara Walker. They're stunning to look at, and they're such a creative and interesting way to revisit the events from the original Candyman rather than just showing footage from that film, and also a way to show the audience new stories within the Candyman legend. Just really beautiful to watch. I think the first act of the film is fantastic. It has this really lovely pacing, which there's no rush to it. It really feels like the film is building up to something for quite a long time. It also has some of the best visuals in it, like I mentioned earlier, some of the best use of sound, again, like I mentioned earlier. And although some of the conversations don't feel the most natural, I did enjoy meeting the characters and how they begin to discuss the legend of Helen Lyle, and then how this inspires Anthony to delve deeper into the history of Cabrini Green. And my final positive for the film is the use of mirrors within this Candyman. Candyman himself is usually only seen by the audience through mirrors and reflections, so when the kills happen, we have this interesting perspective of we see it both as an outside observer, seeing the killings happening but not who's committing them, but then we also do, through reflections around the scene, see Candyman committing the murders. I also like the emphasis of things coming round full circle. So, for example, in the original Candyman, Helen Lyle was investigating the legend of Candyman, and yet in this Candyman, she has become the legend that people tell each other about. And there's also the idea of Anthony being born and raised in Cabrini Green, as, spoiler, he was the baby at the end of the original film, and now he has moved back and now lives on the site where the original Cabrini Green high-rises stood. Okay, now for the negatives. Firstly, the character of Clive, the art dealer or gallery exhibitor. Not a big fan of his. When he's talking to Anthony about his artwork, he tells him to dig deep into his pain, dig deep into his history. Oh, but not that pain and not that history, because that's been done already. Who are you, Clive, to tell somebody that their pain has been done? And the scene in the gallery between him and his girlfriend, the dialogue, horrendous. So Candyman was written by 3 people, and you can kind of tell. There are things that within the screenplay just happen out of nowhere, and yet there are also things that are introduced and then go nowhere. And finally, for my negatives, I have to say that the third act for me just felt a little rushed and slightly messy. After the rest of the film has had this slow and chilled and steady pace, the end seems to come out of nowhere. You suddenly realise, oh, I'm at the end of the third act. Where did that even come from? And also, it feels as though there are parts of the film missing. It feels like there's certain scenes that have been cut. How did Anthony get to the church in Cabrini Green? Why did William, the guy who works in the laundromat, change so drastically and so suddenly? I did enjoy the last few moments of Candyman though, especially as we finally got to see the OG Candyman, Tony Todd. So that's Candyman 2021. I would love to know your opinions on the film, so feel free to leave a comment, remembering that we are all entitled to differing opinions. Thank you as always for stopping by and listening to this humble horror fan's thoughts. I appreciate each and every one of you. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye guys.